etc., etc. So you see a lot of variation. And the labor migrant workers, this is maybe something Paul can talk of more, but them coming to Russia, this is much more of a tool in Russian foreign policy. Of a third of GDP of Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan, half Tajikistan is made up of migrant worker remittances. This is a tool of control. And Russia can use administrative measures, change registration, for example, paperwork, as a way of strategically signaling with Dushanbe and Bishkek, for example, where it is. So if you want to have a color revolution, a Russian-backed color revolution, so-called, in Tajikistan, send all the 18 to 30-year-old male workers, migrant workers, make them unemployed, send them back. And it's a very powerful tool, actually, in Russia interstate relations. So it uses it for that rather than Islam as a bridge. Thank you.
The short answer is no. The longer answer is that it can be a complementary factor of many others. Ever since President Erdogan started with these Turkic summits, the idea is good, but it's not a decisive change in the Central Asian region, not to mention, of course, not every Central Asian state is Turkic speaking, bearing in mind that the Tajiks are not. I think, as I lived in Central Asia, the future of Central Asia will be far more determined by the two main actors which are playing a massive and significant role over there, which are definitely the Russian Federation and China. As a consequence, I basically think that Central Asia will be more or less, as far as the establishment, happily embracing the model that China and the Russian Federation will offer them, which means relatively fast economic growth, if possible, combined with non-democratic political edifice. And that's what I think is going to lastingly decide what happens in Central Asia. For Central Asia, I think the fundamental issue is not to disappear. And of course, your country very kindly, I try to say something positive after I said so many other things, something positive. When I go to Astana or Almaty and meet people and they speak about Kazakhstan is Srednja Asia, that I learned 30 years earlier, 35 years earlier. So you are trying to basically disengage from the other Central Asians, which are definitely far less developed than you are. How the things will change is a little bit unpredictable for a variety of reasons. One of them, that when President Mirziyoyev came into office in Uzbekistan, nobody really had much of a hope. We said, oh, he's 73, he was prime minister for 13 years behind Islam Karimov, what can we expect? Continuity. And a lot of things are happening due to the fact that you often don't know when somebody is the number two, how that person will behave when he becomes number one. My best example, obviously, is Nikita Khrushchev, who was playing in Stalin's courtyard as it was necessary, and then 3 years later went to the rostrum in Moscow and basically made a break with the Stalinist regime at the 20th Party Congress. Indeed, the issue is the external dependence, and I don't think that there is a big race for Central Asia any longer. So basically, the other players are either very lukewarm. Just think about the United States that was cutting 50% of its development aid to Kyrgyzstan, and the same happens with respect of other countries. I don't mention your state because your country is, first of all, as of now, very well managed. Second, you are, in spite of all the little hiccups stemming from the world economy, you are well off. You know, you are a higher middle income country, so you don't need external support. Turkey, going back to the original thing, Turkey is not going to provide a role model, not to mention Turkey is massively facing an overstretch. Currently, if you just take a look to the economy of Turkey, the high hopes that we associated with President Erdogan's last 15 or so years are no longer there. Turkey has gotten to the level when it's above the world per capita GDP average, but it's now sort of a stalemated country. As a consequence, I think Turkey will be better advised to integrate more than disintegrate. As a consequence, I don't think that anybody can move Central Asia together except if there is determination in the region. And I see some determination. The most recent speech of President Mirziyoyev, where he openly said that there is no reason to assume that there will be a war in Central Asia, that was very good news. As a consequence, I have some hopes, but I have no decisive hopes, and Turkey is not going to have the necessary weight and power to pull the region out. One comment on migration. In 2015, of course, there was a major problem because the remittances went down significantly in case of Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. Now they are back, by and large, to the 2014 and before level, which is good news for the countries. I think for these countries, the biggest challenge is going to come with a Russian policy which is ready to give Russian passports to anybody who was born in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union came to an end 26 years ago. As a consequence, there may be many people who believe that it's high time to finish this kind of moving back and forth, working in Moscow, living in Dushanbe, and they will resettle to the Russian Federation, which may actually alleviate some of the problems of these countries, but create many others.
Matt Rhodes, could you tell us something about NATO's efforts to tighten cooperation with Finland and Sweden in the context of what's going on in the Baltic now?
Yeah, I mean, these are obviously two of the closest partners of NATO. They've been involved in a number, again, of these initiatives from recent summits. Maybe going back, again, in the summit terms to the Wales summit of September of 2014, there were a couple of things that took place there that were especially important for Sweden and Finland. One is that using that summit as a kind of a meeting opportunity, those two countries signed so-called host nation support agreements with NATO to allow NATO troops to exercise or potentially come in a crisis to those countries. There was also something called an enhanced opportunities partners initiative passed there for 5 countries, including both Finland and Sweden, along with Jordan, Iraq, and the 5th one will come to me later, but it doesn't matter, but to give them kind of additional opportunities to work more closely with NATO early on in NATO planning, to improve their interoperability with the alliance. So these are two countries that step by step are kind of pushing the envelope of what NATO partnership allows to non-members. They are becoming really the closest two non-member partners of the alliance. I think at the same time there's an ongoing political debate in those two countries about whether taking that final step, making it legal, as we say when two young people are considering getting married, and actually becoming full members. It seems that public opinion is becoming more supportive of that, but it's still not quite at that final threshold where they are ready to say, yes, this is what we want to do. They seem to have linked their decision to making kind of a mutual decision that you would each come in only if the other was doing the same thing. But in the meantime, there's much more sharing of information, including fairly sensitive information about defense within the alliance. There's a lot of cooperation with Finland and Sweden within the context of the Nordic defense cooperation, especially for the defense of the Baltic Sea. There's more exercises involving those two countries. Certainly involvement of Finland in particular in this initiative to advance the idea of resilience within the EU and NATO and their partners. So they're becoming, I think, closer and closer, more so than any other partner nations of the alliance, and it's potential that within the next, say, 3 to 5 years, they could actually make a decision to become full members.
Just to follow on, Swedish newspapers are reporting counterintelligence officers in Sweden as saying that half the Russian embassy in Stockholm is FSB, and that they're carrying out critical infrastructure, national infrastructure mapping in communications, media, and energy sectors. And so this is part of the resilience issue of making the public aware, raising awareness within society as to Russian destabilization efforts. And I think that has an impact, obviously, on then threat perceptions within Sweden and Finland about Russia and Russia's intent. What some analysts argue is that if you have elite consensus or a shift within the elites, as you've had in Germany vis-à-vis Russia after 2014, then society follows. So the lead indicator would be, what are the political elites saying, I think, in Finland and Sweden? If they move, society will follow them. If they frame and lead the debate about membership, and they're not there yet. So it's very interesting from a Russian perspective. What would Russia have to do to have a decisive shift or shock amongst the elite that then pushes for NATO membership? And that would be extremely interesting. And is this issue of brinkmanship, Russia doing brinkmanship, does it know where the brink is? You have thresholds that you cross thresholds, and you have a paradigm shift in opinion. Is Russia aware of does it have the knowledge really of those societies? And because Russia clearly doesn't want those two states. What Russia's pushing for is a non-block or non-aligned space from Finland, Sweden, through Belarus, Ukraine, into the Western Balkans, via Moldova, Georgia, etc., and to have a kind of cordon sanitaire, a non-aligned block, a buffer zone around itself. So this would be highly, highly counterproductive, which goes, I guess, to the issue of Russia's very good at tactics, has a vision but no strategy, and therefore cumulative losses are the result.
If I can just also comment on that. I mean, we talked this morning as well about various dates that are kind of geopolitical turning points, 2008, 2014, and others. It was interesting that already in 2007, although we think of Finland in terms of Finlandization and accommodation of the Soviet Union during the Cold War and of Russia since, already in 2007, the defense minister of Finland at that time gave a speech in Washington, D.C., in which he famously identified the top 3 security concerns for Finland as Russia, Russia, and Russia. It seemed paranoid at the time, but since is a little bit less so.
So I wonder, Professor Królikowski, the notion of territorial defense, which is being discussed now in the press, and particularly over the last 2 weeks when the new defense review came out, is this an idea that this government has pushed since it came into power? Because I recall a very long time ago, at least 10 years ago, perhaps as long as 15 years ago, Zbigniew Brzezinski talking about this and saying that the Russians are on the Belarusian border, and if they wanted to, they could be in Warsaw in just a few hours. So the idea was out there much earlier than the last 2 weeks. And my question is essentially, is it this government that has awoken to this situation, and it's a reaction to what happened in Ukraine? So the new Russian tactic of jab, grab, and hold, and the awareness that old NATO strategy was no longer adequate to prevent that kind of scenario?
The answer is yes. That's one. Second, the territorial defense is not only the Polish idea. For example, of course the names are different, and the forms are different. So in the United States there is a National Guard, which is different than the Polish territorial defense. However, this is kind of the territorial service. So there is a territorial defense and territorial defense forces command in Norway, for example. There is a strong territorial defense in Finland, in Sweden. So this is not only the Polish original idea. So the reason mentioned by you is very important, but there are also a few other reasons. One is because we need more soldiers. In a professional army, we've got only 100,000 people, which is not enough. Today is free, not the full-blooded, full-sized divisions. This is not enough to provide country defense. So we have to find also the solution for the reserve training. So of course, we are going to extend the forms and, let's say, the offer of the forms of the reserve trainings for the students, for the boys and girls from the middle schools. However, the territorial defense, this is one of the tools to extend and enlarge the reserve training. So territorial defense is also important for the saturation of the territory of Poland, especially in the area neighboring to the not NATO countries. So, of course, there is some discussion about the quality of the territorial defense, about way of the training, but let's give the chance for the new formation. For example, because this is a problem with the language, we use very often in Polish wojsko zawodowe czy wojsko profesjonalne. Yes? In English, this is the same word for these two form of the military service. However, I would like to say that, for example, the Israeli armed forces are conscript armed forces, but no one is going to say that the Israeli army is not professional. Yes, so let's give the chance for the territorial defense in Poland. This is not I think personally that this is not a stupid idea. This is a quite effective way to extend the Polish defense capabilities.
Thank you. Questions from the audience?
Mariusz Antonowicz, Vilnius University. I'd like to ask a question. Given the fact that that country has the second largest army in NATO, do you consider Turkey as a security issue and as a certain ticking bomb inside of NATO, given what has been happening there for the last 2 or 1.5 years? Thank you.
Who are you directing your question to?
To all the panelists, thank you.
I guess I'll start, but hope for relief from my colleagues. I mean, certainly there's a lot of strain and concern about the relationship with Turkey. Maybe the biggest, most immediate thing is that perhaps something like a third of the officer corps, including many who have served in NATO positions in Brussels and other commands, have been arrested or dismissed from their positions under suspicion of involvement in the coup attempt against Erdogan last summer. So all of a sudden, as you said, you have your biggest or second biggest military force in a way almost decapitated in terms of professional experience, and with some questions at least on the validity of the charges in some of the cases involved. So this is one concern. The second concern, of course, is the relationship between Turkey and Russia, including the talks between Turkey and Russia for the purchase of air defense missile systems, which would not be compatible with NATO systems and could lead to kind of a larger Russian military presence in terms of advice and maintenance and operation of the systems on Turkish territory. And then there's the ongoing concern about the direction of Turkish politics, whether it will remain true to the democratic values that are mentioned in the Washington Treaty and which are, a foundation of the alliance. At the same time, I think they recognize the importance of Turkey, the other allies recognize the importance of Turkey not only for its large size and its large military, but its key geographic location. And that especially as the alliance is concerned also of fighting terrorism, of fighting ISIS in Syria and elsewhere, this location is of particular relevance and importance. So I think there will be every effort by the alliance to keep Turkey, at least formally, on side, even though there is this kind of suspicion and doubts about its future trajectories, with one kind of small symbolic result is that next year's NATO summit is expected to take place now back in Brussels, whereas before there were a lot of talks about it possibly being in Istanbul. Others like to jump in.
Oh, okay. Yeah, just really to agree with Matt, what you see in Turkey is a move to one-party state, historical, charismatic legitimation of political authority from legal rational, rather like in Russia. So it's kind of paradigm shift that we're seeing. And the impact on NATO is that Turkey is no longer an anti-A2AD player in the Black Sea region, which really puts all the emphasis now on Romania, Bulgaria in that part of the world, which don't have the capabilities really to perform that function. The kind of one ray of hope is that the Putin-Erdogan relationship is not really institutionalized, it's very personal. And we saw in 2015, was it, with a Sukhoi 28 being shot down, or 27, that because of that, the relations can really shift very quickly. So the end game now around Mosul and Raqqa, what goes on in Syria, where the Kurds are in the north that have relations with the PKK, which is the, for Turkey, Syria is like Ukraine for Russia, if you like, and this is really the backyard of Turkey. And the number one threat is Rojava project, so Kurds in the north of Syria getting access to the sea and having an independent area. So how Russia can play that, go after ISIS, but not support I suppose from a Russian perspective, it's all about not supporting the Kurds as much as the Americans are. And as long as you can do that, you've got, the Americans take the heat, if you like.